last year, but one of the amazing things is that we can communicate and connect digitally. So good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from in Chicagoland or wherever for this conversation, because it is a conversation that continues. And our Chicago Voices of the Community is a town hall series. It's a digital town hall series so that everyone can participate. And each week we pick a different topic, the topic that is certainly relevant in the last year, but certainly has some historical perspective and some issues that of past and present, and certainly how we look forward, what we can do looking forward. So today we are talking about redlining, and I kind of call this from redlining to green lighting financial success for families of color. I'm ABC7's Leah Hope. I'll be your host today. But of course, the perspective and the important conversation is going to come from our guests today. So just to give you some perspective, so many people have heard of this term, but may not know its significance. Redlining is a practice of denying loans and resources to people living in predominantly African-American inner city areas. It was a practice for decades in the real estate and financial industries, which literally color-coded communities and steered lending away from those areas. And I have just a little, this is from the mapping inequity. I don't want them to get mad at me for using this, but I'm just going to try and show this to you. This is kind of, it's in pink, but it was in red. It was truly in red. So the areas that were in red, the realtors, the banks, they would look at the address where someone was applying and they would determine whether they were worthy of a loan. And if they were in those red areas, they weren't. And guess who lived in those red areas? So that term redlining comes from government maps that were created during the New Deal in the 1930s. The color red indicated urban neighborhoods deemed hazardous or not worthy of federally backed mortgages. So therefore, the residents in those areas could not get a traditional mortgage. Redlining is also seen as a major factor of segregation in the public school system. As important, it created a wealth gap that continues in many Black and Brown communities today. So over the decades, so many of these neighborhoods have become blighted with growing numbers of vacant lots, abandoned buildings, further diminishing the population and then the resources that come with population. So that's our past, but let's get current. There is a dedicated group of committed community groups, leaders, champions who are trying to reverse those trends. You are going to hear from them today. We welcome your questions and comments on our Facebook pages, on the ABC7 Facebook page, as well as my Facebook page, Leah Hope, ABC7 Chicago, because we want to hear the direction where we should lead this direction of conversation. We certainly know that we want to talk about then and now and where we are going. So much to cover in this hour. So let's get to our guests. Lamel McMorris will introduce first, and if you could just wave so people know who you are. I know who you are, so it's nice to see you this afternoon. Lamel has done so much, but just to give you an idea, he is the founder and managing principal of Green Lining Realty USA, a comprehensive urban property to redevelopment firm founded in 2016 that was launched in Mr. McMorris's childhood neighborhood of West Lawndalian, right?
West Woodlawn.
Woodlawn. You know, I spent so much time in Lawndale. I'm so sorry. We are going to talk about Lawndale for sure. West Woodlawn.
Yes.
On the south side of Chicago, dedicated to reversing the historic effect of redlining in low-income communities through developing quality housing, vibrant commercial corridors. Green Lining Realty USA creates pathways to capital essential for neighborhood investment, redevelopment, and housing rehabilitation and home improvement. Welcome, Mr. McMorris.
Thank you.
I'm going to call you Lamel, if that's all right, for this conversation.
Absolutely.
Our next guest, Asia Butler. Hello, Asia. And she's got that nice background there. It looks like she's outside in Englewood. And I have been to that corner. it's snow covered right now. So I appreciate that you gave us that summertime view. Um, Isha Butler is the co-founder and CEO of Resident Association of Greater Englewood. So the acronym RAGE, whose mission is to create tangible solutions and mobilize residents and resources to restore its community. She founded RAGE to ensure that housing in Englewood happens from the bottom up to avoid gentrification or displacement. It is a resident funded, resident led association of members who reside in all 6 wards of Greater Englewood. RAGE members are homeowners, stakeholders, business owners, professionals, students, parents, grandparents, fighting against the stereotypes that often stigmatize Englewood. Welcome, Miss Butler, and if I can't call you Asia.
Yes, thank you.
All right. And our next guest is Matt Wilson. Matt, hello, is a senior research specialist at the Great Cities Institute of University of Illinois, Chicago, where he primarily works within the employment and economic development, local, regional governance, and community well-being research clusters. So the important part of what he's doing and how it relates to all this, he performs research and evaluations of economic development policy and the real estate market, as well as youth employment and unemployment and employment in the manufacturing sector. He's got a really interesting study called the Hardship Index. We're going to definitely talk about that. Welcome, Mr. Wilson, Professor Wilson. Can I call you Matt?
Please call me Matt.
All right, great. Good to have you here. We love to have all this perspective. And our next guest is Sherry Runner. Hello. She is the co-founder of Black Researchers Collective. Now that was established in 2020. The collective helps communities leverage assets and equip them with research tools that allow them to become more civically engaged, helps communities utilize community data and research, and incorporate and use a racial equity lens to leverage findings to develop a series of policy briefs and infographics that aim to influence policymaking and improve community outcomes. And I'm sure many of those joining us today will remember Sherry's tenure at the Chicago Urban League as president and CEO, after also serving as senior vice president for strategy and community development. Good afternoon, Ms. Runner. Sherry, if I can. And also joining us, just in the nick of time, we need your voice, sir, Richard Townsell. Mr. Townsell is the executive director of the Lawndale Christian Development Corp., and that returning in 2015 after an earlier term from 1992 to 2006, after which he served in other leadership roles throughout Chicago. Now, under Townsell's direction, LCDC brought in more than $40 million in redevelopment to North Lawndale. During this time, LCDC also broadened its program offerings to include youth and adult education and job readiness. Since its inception, LCDC has completed $100 million in residential and commercial development and contributed to more than 360 units of affordable housing to the North Lawndale community. I have spent much time with all of you over the years, but most recently with Mr. Townsell, if I can, Richard, in the North Lawndale community. I did a series last year talking about redlining and how it impacted different communities, and we just decided to focus on thinking about Dr. King when he was here in the 60s. And actually, when he was here, he was talking about and fighting for housing equity and education equity. And he was in Lawndale. It was called Lawndale then, right? Because it wasn't the North and South, right? So he was in the North Lawndale community, actually, not too far away from where Mr. Townsell actually grew up. So thank you, all of you, for being here. We have a lot to get to, and we certainly need to keep perspective of where we were, right? We have to understand our history to know where we're going, where we want to go. Who would like to start us off to discuss how redlining, how those connections, how those disconnections, how that segregation, how that still has ties to where we are and that racial wealth gap.
Give some background. And if you have, what I'd like to say though is that redlining was an iteration all the way back from 40 acres and a mule when that stopped, going through contract buying. And that became famous when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote the case for reparations. Redlining, and then more recently, predatory lending that really decimated neighborhoods when we went through the Great Recession. And of course, as we came out of that, we thought we were teaching and making sure that people knew that they should not be the victims of large profit machines, banks, and others that were going to use them to make their balance sheet, but not to build the balance sheet of the individual that was buying homes. So it's really a part of the American dream to own real estate, and to create that as a method of intergenerational wealth transfer, and consistently, redlining, predatory lending, the issues that we're having right now with not being able to buy and sell, although Chicago in some areas is doing quite well in terms of home buying and home selling, is a long-term problem that has created and absolutely destroyed the wealth that was available to African Americans in this city and also all across the country during the recession. And that is, in turn, an inability to pass that on and get people moving forward as they should.
And of course, that wealth gap, that generational wealth gap, historically, someone makes money, does well, they pass it to their children pass it to their grandchildren, and so on and so on. And of course, what Sherry's talking about meant without anything to pass on, that gap got wider and wider. Lamel, can you talk a little bit about, I mean, of course, your company is called Green Lining. So trying to reverse some of these inequities. Tell us a little bit about, you just broke ground on Woodlawn Point, a mix of new and rehab residential properties in West Woodlawn. Tell me how that and some of the things you're working on are trying to reverse these trends.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you to you and ABC for having us here. And one of the things that I hope happens beyond the great discussion today, and we kind of touched on it before we went live, is that all of us will figure out a way to work together going forward, and that would be phenomenal. Lawndale is not far from Woodlawn. Inglewood certainly isn't far from Woodlawn, and we certainly need the expertise of Matt and Cherie and data to go forward and do all that we're doing. But specifically, yes, launch greenlining to go directly at the historic practice of redlining in my childhood neighborhood in Woodlawn, along with my childhood best friend from high school, Sean Harden. And the premise is just that. Where they drew, and you talked about those lines, where they drew red lines, we're attempting to draw green lines. And that symbolizes not just real estate development, because, we all know that if you're really serious about true neighborhood transformation, it's not simply going to be done by building new houses on vacant land and rehabbing blighted houses. As a child of West Woodlawn, 66 in Cottage Grove, and even now being labeled, ironically, as a quote unquote developer, I'm really serious, and we are very serious at Greenlining. We know that the commercial corridor, the education at my grammar school down the street, the healthcare, job spur and job creation, working with the YWCA, working with Sunshine Gospel, working with Blacks in Green, working with Project Hood. We've got to be an integral part of the community. We just can't be developers who are flipping and building and coming in. That's if you're really serious about true neighborhood transformation and really reversing the historic practices of that happen with these lines and discriminatory lines drawn with red lines. So redlining. We're diving in, and real estate just happens to be the vehicle, and one way that we can increase wealth, one way that we can increase and affect job creation and transform our neighborhood.
Sorry, I was muted for a moment. Perhaps Richard, you want to jump in here and talk a little bit about what's happening in North Lawndale. You've got the MLK development there, what you're trying to do in your childhood community as well.
Sure. Yeah, Dr. King lived about 2 blocks from where I lived in North Lawndale when he came in January of 1966, and when he was assassinated in '68. And then later, the building that was there that he lived, the 3 Flight building, was torn down. And so we decided in 2012 to build a building in his honor. He came to Chicago to end slum housing. And so we wanted to build a building that he would be honored to have stayed in. And it's a $17 million development, 45 units, 6 commercial spaces. This spring, we're going to bring in a new restaurant. St. Anthony's Hospital has a portion. And we also have an exhibit center in honor of Dr. King, in addition to others like Al Raby, who was here, Mark Satter, who was one of the lawyers that started the Contract Buyers League. And as we're talking about redlining, you know, there were folks of goodwill that were fighting it. They helped organize the Contract Buyers League, which fought because people had to buy homes on contract in Chicago and in our neighborhoods in the 50s and the 60s. And so because of their work, Black folks can buy homes and with mortgages now. We're also working on building 1,000 homes for working people. So we have launched a campaign with an organization we're part of called United Power for Action and Justice, where we're going to build 1,000 homes. There are over 1,000 vacant city-owned lots in North Lawndale. And our goal is to build homes for working people. This spring, we're going to start on the first 250 of those homes. We just closed on another project, multi-unit rental that we're going to be renovating this spring, and you know, we're going to be working on some senior housing. Our health clinic, you know, is a major player in the neighborhood as well. But more importantly than projects, you know, we've been organizing. So we organize with an organization called the North Lawndale Homeowners Association, where we have 300 home buyers that have all come together around a comprehensive community plan that was sponsored by the North Lawndale Community Coordinating Council. And so, you know, like our brother Lamel said, we're beyond just thinking about real estate development. We're doing so much more than that.
And just while we've been talking, thank you, Rodney Ware, for your comment. And also an interesting comment coming in from Mary Mahomes, saying that redlining also occurs with rental properties. With some of the new housing developments in gentrified neighborhoods, some of those from the neighborhood are having a hard time even affording to stay. And perhaps Aisha, you can jump in here, what you're doing in Inglewood, because it's you saw how things were starting to change in other neighborhoods. So trying to make sure that people in Inglewood can stay in Inglewood. Talk a little bit about what you're doing to address that.
Yeah, so we thank you so much for this panel and listening to some of the historical concepts of what all of us have to wrangle through as we do this work. And so many points that was made really helps me to know that we're right on the right track. One of the things that we didn't really talk about is the actual psychological effects that redlining and contract buying and some of the things that we deal with actually have on our generations who are no longer interested in buying a home because grandma or great grandma home was taken away through these kind of policies, right? And so the psychological part of the work is very important because we see the vacant lots, we see the abandoned buildings. So a lot of our work first is like psychological and getting people to see these things as assets that can be transformed, assets that can be revised, assets that we can take ownership of, regardless of all the things that we went through historically. So even with that same concept, we about 3 or 4 years ago, we started a campaign called Buy the Block. And we were very intentional on telling people to buy the block just as an aspirational way for you to think about purchasing your first home. It is possible, as Richard said, in Inglewood, we have over 5,000 vacant lots. So we were the pioneers around the large lot program that allow homeowners who are here to also buy land. And so it was realistic to buy the block. And I think the psychological work that we have to do with these campaigns, and then adding that with the housing counseling, the financial wellness, and then actually doing development to give them a nice product to live in, it's all a part of the work. And I think all of our communities are these, where Black folks migrated for home ownership, where my grandfather came and bought his first home after leaving the projects. And so that legacy of home ownership and community building is still apparent, regardless of some of those systems that really tried to dismantle Black communities. So a lot of our work is rooted in that, and acknowledging our past, but also thinking about the future and the people who are here right now today in a community with not many amenities, not the best school systems, not a vibrant corridor. How do we get them to want to invest? And it's really around us as people connected first, and then building that out together. And that's what our work is rooted in.
And certainly we know that you are walking that walk because you have that block right
Yes,
behind you.
I did buy my block. That's what you're looking at behind
Walk
me.
the walk.
And some people have to see it sometimes before you roll out a program. They actually have to see that it's possible. And I just wanted to make sure that people saw that it was possible, and it will still be possible regardless of what happens east of us in terms of Woodlawn and what the Obama Center might do for a community like Inglewood. We still want to have a stake here and ensure that we're not gentrified out.
And actually, Matt, this would be a really good time to kind of jump in and talk a little bit about the work that you've done, this hardship index and the legacy of redlining, the legacy of segregation. Tell us a little bit about why I guess you started to look into this, and what you found. What is the reality now?
Yeah, well, I want to start by thanking ABC7 for having us for this important conversation. And so there was a hardship index that was created to compare cities. So we could make comparisons across different cities and say, for example, how does Chicago compare to New York or to LA? And at the Great Cities Institute, we wanted to apply the same index to Chicago's community areas to get a better understanding of how hardship actually compares within areas of the city. And I think the importance of kind of these indexes is that we can combine multiple indicators into one kind of composite number. So we know that so many of our these complex policies like redlining, they impact us in so many ways, and they're interconnected. I think, like Aisha said, there's this kind of this physical element of kind of physical trauma, emotional trauma. We know that the neighborhood that you live in is related to your employment outcomes. You have different access to jobs, different access to quality education, safety from environmental hazards. Those are all things that we want to think of when we think of these policies like redlining. So what this hardship index does is it combines all of these into one composite indicator, so we can get a better idea of kind of what inequalities exist and how they're interrelated with each other. So we wanted to do this to, I think one of our missions at the Great Cities Institute is to empower people with data. So we've had a lot of feedback that this has been helpful for people in kind of whether it's securing resources or understanding kind of the strategies for the community projects and things that they want to do. And I think, so when we think of redlining, and I think there's this question of, well, this happened so long ago. How can we really see how it still applies today? So I think we have this systematic denying of loans and denying of investment. But I think it's really important to simultaneously understand that the federal government also was pouring money into the suburbs for white-only communities. So there was, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was these investments happening in the suburbs for white populations, and they were able to generate so much wealth, while simultaneously these redline communities were generating so little wealth, and they were being systematically denied. So when the kind of fair housing policies come online in '68, there's already so much damage that's been done in terms of the wealth gap. And I think what we see today in our segregated communities and what the hardship index is showing, is that there's these policies that, so once the fair housing stuff comes online, our wealth gaps are so big already that housing becomes segregated within the city because of these wealth gaps that exist. So although it's not implicitly written into law that that there is kind of the systemic racism built into the policies, we have still this giant wealth gap that is going to continue to segregate communities, and that's what we see coming through today.
So with that historical perspective and current perspective, is it reversible? Obviously, all of you are kind of working in different ways toward toward limiting that gap, reducing that gap. But is it possible at this point? And what does it mean for families now trying to buy their first home, or even just trying to afford rent, trying to find live in a neighborhood where there's good schools? You hear about your zip code and how that informs so much about you to these corporations, even your insurance, right? Your insurance, your zip code, whether you pay more insurance and less insurance. So what is the reality? Is this reversible, or is there a way to try and reduce this wealth gap moving forward?
I think Matt just laid out the solution, and I think Aisha laid out the solution, and I think Richard laid out the solution, and I think Sheree laid out the solution. And it's one word: investment. So it is shocking that we could literally lay the historic red line federal maps on Woodlawn, on Lawndale, on Inglewood from 50 plus years ago, and we see the same issues that you referenced, Leah, that Dr. King was talking about: disparity in wealth, disparity in housing, disparity in education, disparity in health. And so if we could lay those same maps down, and as Matt talked about, the investment, federal and otherwise, went to predominantly white suburban areas, yes, reversible. Put the money back where you denied it. Put the money back and invest. And that's really our challenge. That's our challenge to elected. That's our challenge to the business and corporate community. And it's reversible because you just articulated, and Richard just articulated, the incredible amount of money that is being invested, but yet still the same systems and issues are in Lawndale right now. So we need a ton of investment, and we must lift up together and demand and command and do what we're doing. Give people an opportunity to pour in. Yes, we're pouring in millions of dollars working with an organization, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, based in DC, seeking other partners as well, working with the Cook County Land Bank. Millions of dollars are being invested in Inglewood, in Woodlawn, and in Lawndale right now, but the gap, we're talking not just 50 plus years, but we're talking about a 400 plus year wealth gap that we have to work through.
So
I'd also like to
go ahead, Richard.
say that I heard Cordell West say once, if the war on poverty was a real war, like the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, we would have a budget.
Right.
If you look at the Defense Department budget, which, by the way, one of the only things that Trump got, he vetoed and he was overridden on in his entire 4 years, was the Defense Department budget that just happened. $740 billion. It dwarfs every other nation, Russia, China, you name it, right? So all of our money is going to a war machine. And we also have, the elite not paying their fair share in terms of taxes. This is a conversation that we should be having, right? Between those two issues, if you want to talk about how do we rebuild neighborhoods like ours, there's the money. Defense Department budget and billionaires paying their fair share so that we could have not just a social safety net, but also beyond the safety net where we're catching folks, we have the opportunity for folks to build wealth and equity. But you gotta get the money.
So getting this investment, Sherry wanted to make a comment. I wanted to just get to, I want to hear what you had to say, but as I'm hearing the importance of the investment and bringing community money back to these communities, I'm just thinking of what's gone on this last year and the willingness for any of these institutions, any of these municipalities, for the federal government to want to spend more. So Sherry, your thoughts?
I was going to say something to your point is that in the city of Chicago, prior to COVID, prior to the current administration, the money that was being spent in redeveloping the downtown area was somewhere in the neighborhood of $8.5 billion with a B. And the money that was going to the South and West Side communities that have been struggling since well before the corporate disinvestment in those communities is minor. And when you talk to developers, the major developers that are in or were investing in the downtown area, they feared for, number one, violence, and they feared for that they were not going to get the return on their investment because they weren't thinking broadly. But the other part of this is we really need to make sure that people in our communities are aware of all of the things that they have, the power that they have. And when they are empowered with the knowledge of not being taken by corporate entities that want to make profit off of them, then they can start to hold on to some of that wealth generationally. And that is one of the biggest issues because it has happened repeatedly. It is not just the redlining that occurred. It is consistent. And as I said, the predatory lending was a huge wealth destroyer in this last go round. And that's just been in the last 10, 15 years. And rebuilding wealth of the kind that we're talking about comparatively for the white community versus the Black or Latinx or Asian communities is going to take a long time. But we have to start somewhere, and we have to empower people to know that what they need to do in order to hold on to their profit, their money, and transfer that.
Matt, I see you shaking your head.
I think it's such an important point that we're not mincing words here in saying that it was the federal government, it was the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 30s that drew these maps. It was the Federal Housing Administration that gave these low interest loans to suburbs for them to be built and put in the deeds of the houses that they couldn't be sold or resold to Black families. And I think it's, the point that Richard and Lamel both made, if they can engineer this, they can certainly kind of unengineer it, and they can put the same kind of bold vision of building, the suburbs of the United States into reinvesting in our cities and in communities that have been, neglected for so long. So I think that, the solutions are there. It's amazing to see the work that people are able to do without the massive amounts of resources that are put into this, to creating these conditions. But I think we need to think of, and I love the point that Sherry makes about the kind of subprime lending and how that's, just kind of giving people access to capital isn't necessarily the answer. It's giving people access to capital in a way that they're going to be able to repay, and in a way that allows them to build wealth. So we have to be really kind of careful about how we think about how capital is kind of infused into our communities, and we need to do it on favorable terms to kind of right the wrongs of the past.
And Asia, what are your thoughts about, I know you're doing a lot of this there in Inglewood. I mean, setting people up for success. So maybe they do buy the block, maybe they do reno the home, but it's not just one and done. It's so that they're there, so they are part of the community, they're part of the fabric, right?
Right. I mean, I think it's got to be a mixture of all of these different things. When you think about how really white wealth was developed, they were given acres of land. They were given, when they came and migrated here, they were given opportunities. I mean, we people don't want to talk about like what should be given to blacks who systematically for years have been starved from so many things. So, in a perfect world, we should be able to build as many homes as we want and almost give them to current renters. But of course, we would need investment in order to do that. We work in that same type of vein because none of us are doing this to make a whole bunch of money. We're doing this so that people have that level of wealth that's comfortable for them. It's not the same for everybody. And if you look at the wealth gap of $17,000 for the medium for blacks and 171 for whites, that's a huge disparity. If we could just start there and say, if it is some type of reparations of some sort. Let's get them to the 171. Everybody black who's 18 and older, get to the 171 as a starting point. And then also with the financial tools that we need. I mean, I think we're talking about a government that for 400 years created roadblocks after roadblocks after roadblocks. So sometimes it feels unreversible. I mean, for a lot of us, we're like, this, how could we reverse all of this? But I do think if we examine exactly what the other panelists said, and I'm sorry I lost your name, but all of the resources that was stacked up against a group of people and say, okay, how do we give them land, or how do we give them a home, mortgage free, low interest rates? I mean, it's at that point because it's all of us are still dealing with what our federal government did to our ancestors, and everybody is affected by that. I mean, the only difference with our group, our wealth is what's taken away from us. We didn't have an opportunity, and I think about all of those people who, if there were not contract buying in North Lawndale and Inglewood, what would our communities look like today? And so I think Chicago had a hand in that, and our federal government had a hand in that, and I think they're going to have a hand in helping to reverse it. You can't call it an opportunity zone, and the wealthy people are still the ones who are taking advantage of those programs. That's not opportunity zone for us, and so I think those are like examples of programs that are still perpetuating white wealth and still making sure that blacks stay at this 10 times less opportunity. But I think it's ways that we've learned to navigate through this the best way we can. And I think that's what keeps us all going. We're going to navigate through this, and it's going to be some success stories. But overall, yeah, it's a complete reconciliation from so many different entities about what happened to us and our communities to have us even have to do this work.
So certainly the effect of those of us who are descendants of African Americans, the impact is still with us in certain communities. The impact is still with us. For those who might be watching who maybe don't live in Woodlawn or North Lawndale or Inglewood, for those who live in other parts of Chicago or even the suburbs, why writing this inequity, why is this important for everyone, for all of society? Is it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You mentioned, and he's so relevant because of the time he spent in Lawndale, but also because of the iconic figure that he is. Dr. King answered that question for us that you raised, why it's important, because he said simply, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And everyone likes, especially for your listeners that don't live in the communities where we work and that we're talking about today, everyone likes to talk about Dr. King's speech, I Have a Dream. But in that same speech, he challenged the country around money. He basically said, in his own words, follow the money. He talked about a check that has been given to us, especially those of us who are the disenfranchised of this nation. And he said the check has been marked insufficient funds. And he said, I refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the bank of this nation. And I agree. Today, I would say to all of us, let's pay attention to the infrastructure bill that's about to be introduced. Follow the money. It is, I agree with Matt. It's not just enough to talk about money, but and we do, but I'd rather work on getting the money to Woodlawn and Inglewood and Lawndale first, and then do also simultaneously the battle of how it's going to be distributed equitably and fairly and given and loaned out. But we have to challenge and I think it's important for us to remember, that we are, it says we the people for a reason. We saw at the height and the beginning of this COVID global pandemic, out of nowhere, trillions of dollars appeared.
Right.
We print money. I would invite everyone, it's not enough time to talk about it now, take a look at modern monetary theory. There's an organization called the Our Money Campaign that talks about that we should not, settle for this thought that there's not enough money, because we've seen this nation's ability to print money and put resources where it belongs. And Matt and Aisha are right. Where money was taken away, money needs to be replaced. Reparative justice is what it's called.
I also think that when you start to talk about the systems that are impacted by money being invested in neighborhoods, it not only has an immediate impact, it's not just the home being built, but it's also the schools. What talent is being lost by schools not being up to par? It's also the health, the food deserts. All of these systems have to work together and become more important as you see investment in neighborhoods. And that's why I say when developers from the outside are looking at neighborhoods and deciding that they can't invest in those neighborhoods because the return isn't there. They don't understand the real return of investing and leveling the playing field. And once you've leveled the playing field, the investment return is off the charts. And that's when you start to see real knowledge and real growth in these communities. And we don't know what we've missed over the decades of people being disenfranchised from their communities. Larger, Chicago versus Lawndale.
Anyone else care to address people's comments? I haven't seen any come in yet, but I'm just wondering. I talk to people throughout the city, around the state, and of course we're all connected virtually now. And everyone is so hyper focused on their world right now because of all that's going on. So to try and think about what's happening down the street, what's happening in another neighborhood that's not my neighborhood. Sherry touched on the resources and the education dollars, the things that come to a neighborhood when there are more people there. Does anyone else want to address kind of what can happen when you do have stakeholders? Richard, as you do see people moving back to North Lawndale, and Aisha, as you see people deciding, instead of I'm getting out of Inglewood, I'm staying right here in Inglewood.
I think that we need to understand predatory capitalism doesn't really care about race. And so when you think about neighborhood to neighborhood, when Dr. King was around, when he was alive and he was killed in Memphis, he was trying to organize, whites and blacks and others that were poor. And so his Poor People's Campaign was about how do we pull together. And I think that's what's missing right now is it continues to be this kind of black-white fight. when it's really the elite win when we're pitted against each other. It's really poor people across the board. Now, I happen to be African American and care about my neighborhood first and foremost, but I think that part of what's going on in Washington and part of the tragedy of January 6th is that there has not been really a message that speaks to folks economically who feel left out and shut out across the board. I think our policy globally has left communities in West Virginia and in Pennsylvania and other places in the Rust Belt just destroyed. And so the degree to which we can begin to think about this does not just impact Black folks, it impacts poor people of every stripe, every race, and we need to really be uh, looking at following the money and figuring out how predatory capitalism is pitting us against each other so that collectively we can begin to move forward and rebuild our neighborhoods.
And I completely agree with that. But one way that people is seeing this spill out, especially during the pandemic, is that these communities that's been starved with very lack of resources and not much money and the commercial corridor, the folks are going to other neighborhoods now because unfortunately Inglewood is not the place where to rob people because most of us are working class, folks here. And so the reason why it's important for everybody to think about what happens when you do starve a community or class of people, that it will spill out to the wealthy. It will impact our downtown corridors. It will impact our Lincoln Parks. And I think we're seeing that and definitely seeing a rise of that in 2020. And so if we're thinking about Chicago in general, Chicago cannot be a great city with communities that look like Inglewood or Roseland or North Lawndale. It will impact all of us. And that's exactly what it's been doing.
And Richard, you mentioned what's happening in Washington and the policy. Lamel, you mentioned policy coming out of Washington, in this pandemic. Is there room to be encouraged about a new administration and the direction we might go to try and minimize or reverse some of this wealth gap?
Yeah, it is an opportunity not just for refresh, but reset. But our charge as those of us who are working in the community is to hold all elected officials accountable. I love the saying of the Congressional Black Caucus when they were founded years ago. In politics, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. I think when we keep our interests paramount, and for those of us on this call today, and that is our communities, and that is investment in our communities, investment where red lines were drawing green lines, that's when we win, not necessarily getting caught up with who's in the White House, who's in the mayor's office, who's in the Senate. I think keeping our interests paramount allows us to get the change that we need.
Anyone else encouraged or see the opportunity? I'm afraid to use the word opportunity after Aisha. You mentioned how some are using that term, but the opportunity as people are starting to explore aid and support coming out of this pandemic.
I think there are opportunities. I think one thing that I'm concerned about is that we get excited about cabinet picks and the diversity of cabinet picks, and we haven't really heard, most of the work that impacts us comes through HUD, and the new Secretary of HUD doesn't really have a housing background. We have no idea what's going to happen with that budget, whether it's going to be increased. I still think defense spending is off the chain in terms of what we're spending to keep the military complex going. And so if there's not going to be a radical shift, particularly as we think about how this election was won and who won it for Joe Biden, and to me, tokenism in terms of cabinet picks is not enough to undo the harm that we've been talking about for the past 50 or 60 years. There's got to be a radical shift at HUD towards rebuilding And I have not heard one campaign promise at all about that.
And
Yeah,
is,
oh,
go
sorry.
ahead, Aisha.
No, I just was gonna say exactly building off that for us, for me on the ground, looking at, appraisals and the values of homes and the cost of construction and all of those things are things that we point at. So yes, it's nice that we're having conversations around the wealth gap at at the highest level, but at the end of the day, if we're not really examining all of these different steps that really has gotten us here, it's just going to be campaign rhetoric. So I think our work is always very important to keep at those things from every single angle that has affected home ownership or access to capital or wealth. I mean, it's so many different machines that are playing in that sandbox that Washington is actually not enough. It's all of it. And so it's great, and hopefully we can get some things done. But you're right. If we don't look at HUD, which is one of the biggest things that have almost held us back in some ways, we're just going to be spinning our wheels.
Is that part of the challenge? I mean, the reality of our system, there's an election every 4 years. Matt, as you're looking at that hardship index and things that might change, are you also looking at how perhaps there might be some continuity in effort? Let's see, Matt, we're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things I study actually is opportunity zones. And I think I agree with Richard that I'd like to see certainly more and different things out of HUD. I think opportunity zones as a strategy, I'm not very excited about. It's essentially a program where wealthy investors can park their capital gains in the communities without necessarily having to engage with the communities, without having to respond to community needs. It's an investment tool that I think if that's our kind of big, bold urban policy, I think we're going in the wrong direction. So I definitely agree with Richard in terms of wanting to see a different role. And I think that what we can get out of our continuity is kind of our energy, I think, in our kind of the devotion that we have to changing things, more so than kind of our programmatic kind of suite of things that we look at now.
And believe it or not, we are getting close to our 1 hour time. I feel like we just scratched the surface. I don't know about anybody else, but we have gotten some interesting comments in. Fiona Cross, makes the point. This is a problem all over America, which is what we've been talking about. And then Deonde Brown Whitfield talks about the challenges in the Austin community. I don't think we have anyone here from Austin, but certainly Austin is an important part of the fabric of Chicago, and certainly is one of these communities that has been affected by this legacy of disinvestment. I want to make sure I give ample time to everyone. As we try to be forward looking, we try to look at what can I do. I'm looking in the mirror. What can I do? The people who are watching us here, if each of you could just take a moment to talk a little bit about what you're working on and what you hope people might do.
I would say the first thing that people have to understand is for decades we have been working on trying to make sure that people are aware of African American history, and we have not spent a lot of time understanding what that history has done to the communities that it has impacted. And so it's important now that we're having these honest discussions. Maybe it's the one treasure that Trump left us, is the fact that we can be openly honest about the fact that racism has impacted our communities in very negative ways, and it has been compounded year over year. So I think it's time for us to be aware. And as our panelists have all said, we have to hold our representatives accountable. They can't just be there. If you have a seat at the table, you must act as though you were given that seat, and it's a treasure and a gift. You have to be accountable to your communities. And so we must get people aware. The work that I'm doing with both the Humanity Institute and Black Researchers Collective is to make sure that people are empowered and aware and know how policy impacts their communities, and to get actively engaged and involved, not just this one election, but every election.
How about you, Aisha?
I would just say, I know for us, if you are in a position that you can invest in a community or a community you grew up in, be it, you know, a homeowner, rental property, a business, invest. I mean, if we're talking about this massive disinvestment from federally, which we don't know we will ever get or not, locally we can make some changes by investing back in our community. And I would think if you're not in a position to invest, I would say learn what is the best way for you to personally, hopefully, try to achieve wealth, if that's fixing up your credit or savings or whatever the case may be. This won't happen overnight, the dismantle of these systems. So it is small things that you could do now. So at least you have a stake, you have a home, you have land, you have a business, so that we can rotate our dollars in our community, because that's really ultimately all we want, is to have the economy to rotate on our own and look like a Chinatown or a little village or anywhere else where so many other groups had that opportunity to do that. And so I think that is what we are focused on for 2021 and beyond. And if anybody is interested in those type of conversations, specifically in Inglewood, look us up at rageinglewood.org, or, you know, go on our Facebook page, because we definitely are one of the communities that are at ground zero, like many of the other ones, who are trying to navigate through this and just figure out how do we uplift folks, just their economic situation. I mean, that's really all we're really talking about. And it could be home ownership, it could be businesses, whatever we could do to support that.
And Matt, how do you suggest people reverse that hardship that you are seeing?
I think if I could echo some of what already has been said, it's definitely holding elected officials accountable. I think being self-reflective of all of our roles and kind of maintaining some of these systems. And I think it's trying to kind of educate and learn about kind of the complex nature of some of these issues goes a long way into understanding what some of the solutions are. And I think Aisha laid it out so well about some of the things we can be doing.
And Richard, I know you are not only working there in North Lawndale, but still living there. You know, with all the work that you're doing and all the things that you've seen happen in your neighborhood, what would you like to see those watching us do?
Well, I think because of WLS's reach all over metropolitan Chicago, um, I think we're going to do our part to organize our neighbors to hold our officials accountable. But I'm asking your viewers to also hold their elected officials accountable. I think that there are people of goodwill in every political party and in every neighborhood. And there are things that all of us want to do in our neighborhoods. And sometimes there's some recalcitrant legislators or just not knowledgeable legislators that are holding things up from moving. And so what they could do is organize their legislators so that we can begin to rebuild our neighborhoods.
And Lamel, your thoughts, action steps as we leave this hour.
Go to Rage, figure out how to invest in Aisha's work. Go to Richard's organization and figure out how to invest in North Lawndale. Track Matt down and get his brilliant research, and track Cherie down and hire her to help you. Find out everyone, figure out how to work with us in Greenline and Realty USA, or any of the organizations that service West Woodlawn in particular, whether it's the YWCA, whether it's Sunshine Gospel, whether it's Blacks in Green, whether it's Project Hood. And there are resources. I invite everyone listening to please go learn about the Cook County Land Bank Authority if you're really serious about transformation in the neighborhood.
We could talk about the land bank for a long time. I will mention, I think all of you have made appearances on Channel 7 before, but I do want to acknowledge Lamel's first appearance on WLS years ago on Vernon Jarrett's show. We're out of time, but I'm going to look for the tape on that. Thank you all for this conversation. And as we do these these virtual town halls, we will continue this conversation, different topics every week. So we'll see you next Thursday at 2 o'clock. Take care. Be well, everyone.
Thank you.